Hello, and thank you for that incredibly warm welcome. It's very exciting to be here. I'm very, very grateful to the Korean Press Foundation. Fantastic hospitality from you all, and this is a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation about what's happening in journalism. The last time I was in Seoul was back in 2009, and as the chair has pointed out, a lot of things have changed in journalism since then. Indeed, things have changed in the world in general. And as the chair pointed out, with AI, we can expect even more change to come. I think if you think about it, this is the words, this is a website, a research project that's been tracking all the ways that we talk about journalism, all the different terms that we've used to describe, usually to do with the technology, about how it's changed. And you can see what's happening now in terms of politics coming up. There are so many, as you know, from this region, there's so many important elections coming up, including, obviously, here, Taiwan as well. And we're all very conscious of the sensitivity of the politics, but also the importance, therefore, of a healthy information environment. And we're all very much aware that the information environment is not very healthy at the moment. So that's what's at stake in terms of democracy and politics. I should tell you about my journey, which is I was a traditional journalist for nearly 25 years in the UK, working for organisations like the BBC and ITN's Channel 4 News. And I left in 2006. Now, even in that period, there was huge changes, the introduction of digital tools into the newsroom, and then, of course, the arrival of the internet towards the end of the 20th century in news organisations. And then when I left to go to the London School of Economics to set up this think tank called Polis, there was more and more change that came, including, obviously, social media. And so the story of my work over this time has been the story of journalism change around the world. And as the chair pointed out earlier, these can bring positive things to journalism. We are much more creative. We can work much more quickly in lots of different formats, and we can reach people in ways that we couldn't imagine. But of course, there is also the business crisis and other pressures upon journalism as it's become networked. And the same is going to happen now with artificial intelligence. For the last 5 years, I've been working on a project which has been looking at what is happening to journalism because of artificial intelligence. Previously, it was much less exciting. Artificial intelligence was generally something that was looked after by the tech people in a news organization, and the things it did were quite basic, but at great scale and at great speed. It was a relatively simple process, but it was a huge challenge. So we built this project, which we created training programs, education programs. We created a series of courses that journalists could take, and we created the CoLab Fellows, where journalists from different news organizations could work together on particular challenges around AI and journalism. And every year we have a lovely festival in December for a couple of days where all the people talk about what they've been working on with us throughout the year, and we have a wider conversation about AI. And it's clear from that last 5 years that AI can do all sorts of interesting things to help. And the key thing to remember is it does it throughout the news process. So this is before this is before generative AI, this is before ChatGPT. We could see how it could help in news gathering, for example. We could see how it could help in news production. And perhaps critically, we could see how artificial intelligence could have helped with news distribution, connecting people to the journalism that you create, and we hope as well, helping you to raise revenue from your journalism. Good examples of this, this is quite an old one. The Reuters News Tracer helps Reuters to search through social media looking for stories, looking for what's happening out in the world. It's something they couldn't do without AI. This is an example from Swedish radio. They built a tool called Peach, which is designed to support their journalists. When the journalists are working on a particular story, it will automatically suggest material that might help them to tell the story better. And then there's the revenue, as I mentioned, this idea of propensity models, that AI can help you work out what is the best way to get somebody who's clicked on your website to end up as a subscriber. What kind of discount, what kind of offer do you have to make? Well, the AI can automate that process. So this is all before the revolution that happened 12 months ago, in fact, with the release by OpenAI of ChatGPT. And I'm sure, can I just do a quick survey actually? How many people can you put your hands up if you have ever used ChatGPT? If you've ever put a prompt into ChatGPT? Okay. Now the people who didn't put their hand up, I'd really like to know why. Because it's so easy. It's so easy to do. And the results are interesting, not always perfect, but it's a really interesting process. And that user experience is perhaps the most important thing about generative AI, is that it's so easy to use. The old AI, as I said, you needed to be a tech person to understand it. But now everyone can use generative AI, and that's a game changer. It means that everybody in your news organization could, at least, use this technology. And we're aware that it's already, they're creating incredible platforms that use this new technology. ChatGPT, of course, Midjourney and DALL-E, the image generation, and of course, the audio and video generation of platforms like Synthesia, which allow you to create these virtual news readers, for example. And 1,000 other products are going to flow from it. So, it was very clear to me that this was a game-changing piece of technology, and we needed to find out very quickly how news organizations were responding to it. What were they doing with it, and what did they think about it? So we conducted our second survey. The first one was back in 2019, and just a few months ago, this summer, we did a survey of more than 70 news organizations in more than 30 different countries around the world to ask them, as I say, what are they doing with it and what do they think of it? And the most obvious thing, didn't surprise me really, but almost all the news organizations said yes, they are experimenting with generative AI. I'm quite curious about the ones who said they aren't, and I don't really believe them, because I think somebody in their news organization will be trying this technology out. So it's everywhere, and people are starting to play with it. And when they talked about how they were using AI in general, not just generative AI, but any AI, you can see a significant increase, of course, from 5 years ago, but the same profile, the fact that it's being used with all aspects of news creation. So a lot of the attention when it first came out was, can you use it to write articles? I think that's probably going to be the least common use case, the idea that it's going to create a complete article by itself that you publish. But there are lots of other things that it can do. And my colleagues, when they give their talks later, are going to give you a much more detailed understanding of what it can do. Here are some of the things that the people we surveyed said that they were starting to use. And as you can see, completely different use cases. And again, perhaps not surprisingly, they all think that they're going to be using it a lot more in the next few months, in the next year. And what's interesting is the kind of things that they talked about on the right, very important one at the top there, fact-checking with these elections coming up, trying to use it to counter disinformation. But then people also talked about using it to personalize content and to automate content. A lot of people talked about using it to summarize text and perhaps to generate or reformat content. And I think that's going to be a really important function. The last one I thought was really interesting as well, this idea of using chatbots. You could use it to conduct preliminary interviews if you're a journalist, but also this idea of using it to try and understand what people are interested in. I think one of the biggest challenges for journalism is trying to stay relevant to the things, the issues that people in the real world are interested in. What are the challenges that people are facing? Again, not a big surprise, but the main challenge that people are facing is around the technology and, of course, resources. Have you got the money, the time, and the expertise in your news organization to take advantage of it? But it was interesting that the people that we talked to also mentioned these other potential problems around the ethical challenges and the cultural challenges that generative AI can bring, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But certainly, the dark and the light, there's a very strong sense that it's going to present new opportunities for news organizations. But they're very aware that it's also going to create challenges. And I think the interesting thing there is the not sure bit. This is incredibly new technology. People find it difficult to judge, quite rightly. It's much too early to judge the balance of benefits and negatives. But generally speaking, people out there are keen to find out. One of the biggest risks is around the fact that the generative AI, to use a cliche, it's a language machine. It's very good at processing language or images or audio and trying to work out what the format, what the shape, what the content should be. But it has no concept of truth or facts. It's a language machine, not a truth machine. And so you should never rely upon it to be totally accurate. And the people who have experimented with this found that out very quickly. So these were the kind of challenges that people felt that the AI presented. Firstly, this idea of the algorithmic bias. You don't know what these large language models were trained on. You don't know the content that was used to generate the models that they used. There is the challenge that they talked about of upholding journalistic values, such as obviously accuracy, but also transparency and accountability. If you don't understand how generative AI works, then there's that danger that you're not going to be able to be honest with your readers. There's a huge challenge to the business model, that there's a real danger that the information space is going to be flooded by misinformation and also just by kind of clickbait content farms, and that will push the good journalism to one side. And the fear is that that might make it even worse in terms of public trust in journalism. And then there's just the fundamental problem that this is happening so quickly. The journalism, the news industry, has no control, really, over the development of these technologies. And we are very dependent on the big tech companies for generative AI. And then there's other challenges around sustainability, especially for newsrooms, perhaps local newsrooms, for example, but also newsrooms in countries where there's a less healthy economic situation. There's a sense that that could make these things worse. So those are the things that people worried about. But what was interesting was that they were taking action to try and mitigate some of those risks. There's a definite sense that people want to be more transparent, and there are various ways that we can do that. One of the ideas is to have guidelines, and we're going to talk about that later on. But building ethical guidelines for your newsroom to help your journalists and your audience, your readers, to understand the risks and how they can mitigate those risks. The critical phrase that we kept hearing was this idea of always keeping the human in the loop. You should never allow this technology to operate by itself if it's doing anything important. You should always have a human who oversees the data it's using and oversees the kind of product that it creates. And in that sense, the kind of key editorial tasks, the important tasks like deciding which is the most important story, for example, those should remain the responsibility of the human journalists. The other thing that a lot of the people we talked to were doing to try and cope with some of these challenges was to collaborate. They could work with us, for example, or they could work with other newsrooms, or they could work with industry experts, people in universities or startups, or even in the tech companies themselves. So one of the things we came up with in response to this survey was a sort of simple 6-step guide to what you should be doing if you're in a news organization and you're interested in trying to use generative AI. And if you're doing these, then that's great. You're going to benefit more from generative AI than other people, and you're going to be less at risk. The first thing is to get informed. Try and find out about generative AI. Use it yourself, but also, literally read up, do some research, so that you can get past some of this kind of scare stories and get past some of the kind of hype that you get around generative AI. And that means also broadening AI literacy within your whole news organization. It's good if you have one or two people with specific responsibility, but everybody in your news organization needs to know a bit about generative AI and AI in general. And there are more than one reasons for that. Firstly, it is going to have an impact on your work. It already is. So you need to know something about the technology if you're going to be using the tools as a journalist. It's also going to be critical for you to have some AI literacy, because everything that you report on could be influenced now by AI. If you report on financial markets, well, they're going to be impacted by AI. If you report on health, on medicine, for example, well, that's going to be impacted by AI. So it's really important that if journalists want to report upon the world, then they need to know more about AI. The third thing is assigning responsibility. Make sure that there is somebody in your organization who has a responsibility, not just to implement AI, but to find out about AI, to do research, to look at potential tools that they can use, but also then to coordinate internally to make sure that there's a conversation happening about AI. Because I went into a newsroom the other day, a very famous international broadcaster, and that broadcaster has told its staff not to use generative AI. They said it's too risky, do not use it. And of course, the staff that I spoke to in that newsroom are using it. One person I spoke to was a coder. He's doing coding in the newsroom. And he said he was using a generative AI tool and that it was making him 80% more efficient. He was saving 80% of his time. Now, if I was running a newsroom, I would want to know about that, because that's very, very impressive. And I would want to spread the best practice. But of course, I'd also want to make sure that people weren't doing anything that was risky. So I think it's very important to be cautious, but it's also very important to make sure that you're aware of what's happening in your newsroom and getting people to engage with the technology. And when you do, and my colleagues are more expert than I am at this bit, don't just, buy in the AI and plug it in. Test what the tools that you're using, keep iterating the use of it, repeat that, and then review it over time. It's always a process. Make sure you've drawn up those guidelines, because that will give your staff some kind of reassurance, a sense of what they should and should not be doing. And it also says to your readers, for example, that you are not doing anything stupid and you've thought it through. And in my experience, talking to people who have been through that process of drawing up guidelines, just that process itself is really helpful. You have a conversation with people. What should we be doing? What shouldn't we be doing? What are the risks and what are the opportunities? So that's a really important process. And then finally, to repeat again, this idea that you should be collaborating and networking, because we cannot do this on our own. Individual news organizations are going to struggle to do it on their own, but also the news industry as a whole. We are a relatively small sector, and we don't have huge R&D resources. So it's really important that we maximize the resources that we do have. And as I said, that collaboration could be, well, in a sense, what we're doing here by coming together to talk about AI. It could be working with people in universities like me. It could be working with startups. It could even be having conversations with the tech companies. But primarily, I think it's about news organizations learning from each other. And I think this is a really healthy thing. When I was in a newsroom, you wouldn't collaborate with anybody. You wouldn't even collaborate with your colleagues, because we were so competitive and so independent. And I think one of the healthier things that's changed over the last 10 years is that news organizations are getting better at trying to share some of the benefits of new technologies. And also to collaborate, for example, in negotiations with the tech companies, for example. So that's the kind of general guides. I'm going to wrap up by looking at this broad idea of what the key risks and opportunities are. Because I think we've heard a lot about the risks from AI, and some of it's been rather sensational. I mean, in Korea, there were two stories about AI I noticed yesterday. One was a tragic story about a worker in a warehouse being killed by a robot device. Quite a horrible story about the technology being, in that case, very dangerous. The other story was a more positive one. It's this idea that Samsung are now developing their own large language model. At the moment, it's going to be for internal use within the company, but eventually one assumes it could be used on their phones. So a kind of risks and benefits. You can see that happening every day. I think there are three kinds of risks that we have to pay attention to. The first one is the kind of general risk that AI has, especially generative AI. That idea that it can be misused in bad ways if you don't understand its limitations and its flaws. And if anybody's ever used generative AI, you'll see it will tell you. ChatGPT will say, I do not know the answer to that question because I'm not plugged into the internet. Or it will say, no, I'm not supposed to do that. That's beyond my capability. So the developers of these tools are aware of the limits of them as well. And we have to be. That much of the data that these machines were trained on was very Western-centric. It was very English-centric in terms of language. And it contains the biases that we have on the internet. The internet is, has racial biases, and so if these algorithms have been trained on that kind of information, then they're going to reflect that. And so there are real general problems around any kind of use of AI, and a big one that applies not just to journalism, but is around copyright, of course. Who owns the material that these machines have been trained on? But also, who is responsible for the content that they might create? Then the second kind of risks are, I think, the ones that are kind of general to the news industry as a whole. And these are big risks. The first one is obviously this tech dependency, as I've said. The only people with the money to do the groundbreaking fundamental research are the tech companies themselves. So in that sense, they are going to drive, they are setting the agenda for the way this technology is going to evolve. And there is always a danger. We've seen this with social media, that if you base your business model upon that technology, and then the technology changes, then there's a threat to your financial stability. So we're aware of that tech dependency. Then there's this second one, this word, and I'm sorry for the translators, but disintermediation. And what that means, really, this has been happening for 20 years now. And what that means is, with new technologies, the citizen doesn't have to come to a journalist to find information anymore. They can go onto social media, they can go onto websites, and they can find things out for themselves. They don't have to go to a news website. And with ChatGPT, that could be even more easy for them to do. And the difference with ChatGPT is that it doesn't even link back to news articles. So you won't even get that benefit that you get from search. Google search usually includes a link. So there's a real danger there for news organizations that they're going to lose the attention of the public. And again, I think the good side of that is that I can see that news organizations around the world have spent the last 10 years building much stronger relationships with their audiences. For example, with the subscriber or membership model. And I think we're going to have to redouble our efforts to make sure that people want to connect to the news media and that they see the news media as a safe place compared to the disinformation online. And then the third set of risks are the ones that are specific to journalism itself, the actual making of the journalism. I keep mentioning this problem around accuracy, for example, but also the threat to quality. Some people are going to use these tools to create very low-quality journalism. They're already doing that. And that's obviously been a problem for some time now anyway, but it's going to become much, much easier to do that with generative AI. So in that sense, it's a competition, it's a threat to the business model of journalism. But this is the one that I think is the biggest danger of all, in some ways, and that's the danger of journalism being left behind. And by that I mean individual journalists, but also news organizations and the industry overall. That if you're a good journalist, if you're a good human journalist with judgment, skills, experience, expertise, you might be thinking, well, I don't need AI, I don't need generative AI. And I think that would be a tragic waste, because the tools that you could use, even the ones that are available now, the transcription tools, the translation tools, tools that you can use to help organize your research, to monitor your sources, or perhaps to help you, when you've written that brilliant article, to reformat that article, perhaps to turn it into an audio version, perhaps a short version and a long version. And the AI can help you do all that. It's a bit like having your own personal intern who's helping you to do your good journalism. So for the individual journalist, I think the better you are, the more you're going to benefit from this AI. And the same with the news organizations. I think it's very healthy that they're being cautious, that they're being careful, that they're respecting their own values, and they're respecting the needs and ethics of their journalism and their audience. But I think there's a real danger that if news organizations say, well, let's leave it for a few years, we'll see what happens, and then we'll get into the AI, by then it will be too late, because the bad journalists and the bad actors are not waiting. They are already using these technologies to create less good journalism or even anti-journalism, bad information, partisan information. They are already doing it. They are filling the information space. They are using generative AI to do that. And they don't have the moral scruples or the editorial values that I hope that you do. So I think it's even more imperative for good news organizations to make sure they get across this technology and that they don't miss out and get left behind. So to sort of end on a more positive note, I do think there are huge opportunities. We've spoken a lot about the risk, but let's remind ourselves, and I think it's important to remember, journalism really needs some help at the moment. Yes, we can see that certain news organizations are thriving. I'm surprised how legacy media has survived and sustained itself through enormous hard work, but also through widespread innovation as well. And now we've got to do it again. But there are huge gains to be had. For example, the just pure efficiency gains. I remember when the mobile phone first came along, when I was a journalist in a newsroom, and just the amount of time that device, even before smartphones, the amount of time that saved me, the extra power that it gave me to be more literally mobile and to communicate better. And I think these AI tools are going to do the same thing. They're going to save you time and save you effort. They're going to be real efficiency gains. There are also going to be new tools, many of them already out there, that are going to empower individual journalists and news organizations. I think I just mentioned the reformatting one. This idea that you can produce content in the right format to suit your customers or your users, to suit the time of day, for example. In the morning, people might want very short bullet point news. By lunchtime, perhaps they want something that's more substantial, perhaps some video that they can watch. And perhaps in the evening, they want to relax and they want something much more intelligent that gives you more content, that's perhaps a bit more reflective. Well, the AI can allow you to shape your content to suit people's desires. And that's so important, because we're all aware that people now feel quite swamped by news. They feel distressed by news. So it's really important that we help them to have a healthier news diet. And that is going to involve new products and new services for audiences, like, for example, chatbots. And it is going to help us to counter propaganda, bias, and disinformation. There is no technological cure for disinformation online. because disinformation is created by human beings. They use the technology to do it, and the AI technology will make it easier. But in the end, if you want to counter it, you can do your fact-checking and so on. But in the end, it's about identifying the sources of the disinformation. I think the best thing that journalists can do in these circumstances is to make sure that you are the source of reliable news, of transparent and accountable news. That, I think, is the best antidote, if you like, to disinformation. And here's my big hope. This is my big optimistic hope with generative AI. And that is that if we can use it to make human journalists more efficient and more effective, then that's going to mean that the human bit of the journalism, we can concentrate more on that. Because that, in a world where AI is used to create journalism, it's going to be the human factor that becomes even more important. So it's things like investigations, it's things like specialist journalism, it's things like human interest journalism. You have to remember, the AI does not have feelings. It has no morals. It can't feel sympathy. It can't feel excitement. It has no sense of humor. All these things are wonderful human qualities that journalists can have. Journalists can make judgments. The AI can't do that. And my hope is that this could create more time and space for journalists to do what human journalists do best, including real-world reporting. We know that so many journalists are now trapped at their desks. They do their research through email. They do their research through Google. And then they have to publish 20 stories a day just to keep up. And they never actually go out and talk to people. They never actually go out and witness real events. And that is so important because the AI cannot witness. It cannot go out and talk to people. That's the human factor that I think will mean that journalism will sustain its value to people. So, thank you very much for listening. I look forward to the conversations afterwards and also the other presentations from my colleagues. So thank you very, very much.